Of this, Tracy Jan, reporter for the Washington Post, Democratic Congressman Khanna of California, a member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, Russell Zhang, co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate and chair of the Asian American Studies Department at San Francisco State University, and Stanley Mark, senior staff attorney for the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Welcome to you all, guys. Really appreciate it. Tracy, I want to start with you. I was reading your piece in the Washington Post. It was an incredible piece. And at times it was, I have to be honest, an uncomfortable piece to read, considering some of the things that you were talking about, some of the things that you raised. And you talk about the fetishization of Asian women and the deep roots that it has in American culture. How has that heightened fears now amongst Asian women in the atmosphere that we are in, especially following the most recent shooting?
It was an uncomfortable piece to report and write. When discussing whether racism was a factor in this crime, in this shooting spree, whether the confessed gunman attributes racial motivations to his actions or not is almost irrelevant. The fact is that he set out to end the lives of people he viewed as temptations and targeted 3 businesses where Asian women could be found. A signal that he intended to attack Asian women whom he perceived to be selling sex. We're all, in a sense, targets. Whether or not we are selling sex, it's all about perception. And from the beginning of our country's history, there's been this sexual fetishization of Asian women. As far back as the late 19th century, when women from China, Japan, other Asian countries were just barred from immigrating, just on the mere presumption that we would be immoral and be prostitutes. And even then, women and girls from China were regularly kidnapped and auctioned off in San Francisco as sex slaves. So this hypersexualization of Asian women is not just in our distant past. It continues now through our pop culture, our dating websites, porn sites. So many of us have rolled our eyes when men, strangers, feel compelled to tell us about the time they spent in Korea in the military or teaching English in Japan, or their previous Asian girlfriends and current wives. It's like, thanks, dude. What does this have to do with me?
What was your reaction when you heard Tracy at the press conference? The police officer essentially say he was having a bad day, the shooter, and it doesn't seem as if this is a hate crime. It's not being characterized as one. He actually just really had a porn habit, and he was being tempted.
A porn habit and a bad day, and he was being tempted. Again, those remarks show the incredible ignorance and insensitivity to our long history. You cannot separate this crime from racism, sexism, misogyny, and classism in many ways. It was a very ignorant comment to make, and obviously wrong. He's dealt with the consequences of that, right?
Yeah. Congressman, I want to bring you into the conversation here because there's another dangerous stereotype that is often connected to Asian Americans, and that is kind of this idea of being a model minority, right? They're doing well. They're successful. They're upstanding in the community. So what do they have to actually complain about, this idea of being this model minority, as they put it, when, in fact, there are many Asian Americans that, in fact, suffer economically, that make up much of the working class of this country. Why is this so problematic?
Well, Yasmin, you're absolutely right, and I agree with every word that Tracy said. The Asian American community is often not just economically vulnerable, but they're often seen as other. There's often a sexual fetishization about Asian women. One of the things I don't understand is this view that either it has to be racially motivated or it has to be a sex addiction, as if it can't be both. People throw out the word intersectionality all the time, but actually Kimberly Crenshaw, when she came up with intersectionality, was talking about exactly this, that someone can be a victim of a crime both because of their gender and their race. And I think that's what you're seeing here, the intersection of these factors that affect Asian women across America.
Stanley, can you weigh in on that? It seems as if you were agreeing with the congressman there.
Yes, I mean, I think there's enough reported evidence that this has been could be classified as both racially motivated as well as gender and sex discrimination here, and a hate crime at that.
I do want to talk about being classified as a hate crime because it's a major part of this conversation. And we all understand, obviously, how prosecutors look at this thing, and they need to have a burden of proof, right? And there is this idea where when you talk about hate crimes associated with Black Americans, or you talk about hate crimes associated with Jewish Americans, there is something that people can point to, right? There is, for instance, a noose that someone can point to and say, yes, that is a hate crime. There's a swastika that someone can point to and say, yes, that is a hate crime. But there's nothing to point to when it comes to Asian American hate for prosecutors to point to and say, yes, definitively, this is a hate crime. Does that complicate the situation? And how do you come up with proof in order to classify something as a hate crime?
The way it should be dealt with is actually not necessarily looking for something like a shortcut. You have a symbol of some sort. The individuals who are in the police force who are helping to classify a racially motivated or a sex motivated or gender-based hate crime, they have to take into account the totality of all the evidence, and they have to uncover information and look at it without implicit bias. And it's a question for me if these officers were properly trained to classify. I'm thinking of the Atlanta case. The idea that this shooter went to 3 locations that were predominantly owned and operated by Asians and Asian women who are hyper, as one of the guests have indicated, Asians, women have been hyper sexualized. There's this stereotype of exotic erotica. People objectify Asian women. So this is part of our culture. And as a result, by targeting those businesses and specifically killing Asian women in this case, and most of them were Asian women who were killed, this indicates that this had some context that would indicate a motivation both by sex and gender and sex. Gender and race,
Russell, there's currently a rally taking place in Times Square here in New York, a Stop the Hate rally in Times Square. And we're seeing rallies like this taking place across the country. In Atlanta as well, we are seeing a rally take place. How important is it? What does it mean to the community in order to classify a killing like we saw in Atlanta as a hate crime?
In some ways, the designation of this particular crime as a hate crime is significant because it would mean that in the legal sense, we're recognized as facing racism. But in the broader sense, I think the Asian American community already recognizes it doesn't matter what the individual motivation of that perpetrator was, or even what the sheriff thinks. But we know as a community that we're experiencing the broader hate and racism from all of society, a pervasive institutionalized racism that's been impacting us not only in forms of crime, but in verbal harassment, in the denial of civil rights, online harassment, youth bullying. So we prefer the term hate incidents to show the comprehensive, wide-ranging discrimination that we're facing at this moment. Then that's why you see us rallying across the country. Not all of us have been victims of crime, but 3 out of 5 Asian Americans in the latest surveys show have been direct recipients of racism this year. Maybe not crimes, but hate incidents. So we're experiencing this hate. It's traumatizing. Respondents to Stop AAPI Hate are showing signs of racial trauma. People are having higher rates of anxiety, depression. We're being hypervigilant and avoidant of places. So the fear is there. The anger and distress is there. We're grieving with the families of the victims. So for us, whether it's classified as a hate crime or not, isn't as important as the impact on the community and how we're experiencing this crime. And I think we're experiencing it as hate, as racism, and as a clear injustice.
But Tracy, I got to say, doesn't classifying it as a hate crime directly impact the community? This idea that if it's classified as a hate crime, then in fact it'll help the community feel as if they belong, as if they're being defended, rightfully so.
As if the community is being seen and heard, because for so long, the anti-Asian bias and discrimination is pretty much been invisible. A lot of times cloaked in this model minority mythology that we were talking about earlier. It's harmful when during a whole hearing about anti-Asian violence, one of the Republican congressmen mentioned, oh, but you guys are fine. You guys are model minorities. You're the highest income. All of those stats cloud a truth, which is that Asian Americans as a group has the widest wage gap, income gap as a group, because our histories are very disparate. You know, it's a big Asian diaspora in America, and we are all lumped together as Asian Americans. And so our stats are collected together. But in fact, we have the highest income inequality of all racial groups. And people don't realize that, because the model minority myth, which is a white supremacist framing, that's how we're seen.
Congressman, last word to you here on this, because much of this begins at the top, right? Much of changing the narrative on this, speaking out in defense of the Asian American community, it starts at the top. It starts in Washington. And I do want to touch on the House hearing this week on anti-Asian violence. And it was, in fact, overshadowed by Republican Congressman Chip Roy. I want to play for folks what he said, and then we'll talk.
We believe in justice, right? There's old sayings in Texas about, find all the rope in Texas and get a tall oak tree. We take justice very seriously, and we ought to do that, round up the bad guys. My concern about this hearing is that it seems to want to venture into the policing of rhetoric in a free society. And now we're talking about whether talking about China, the Chi-Coms, the Chinese Communist Party, whatever phrasing we want to use, and if some people are saying, hey, we think those guys are the bad guys.
How can Americans have confidence in the U.S. government to put legislation forward to protect the citizens of this country that should be protected when you're hearing stuff like that coming out of Washington?
Well, that was a shameful statement that has no justification and ignorant, of course, of the history of lynching and the use of lynching to target African Americans in this country. But there's a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of our speech tradition in this country. The fact that we have a First Amendment that says that we should not censor speech, that the state should not censor speech, does not mean that we should not criticize speech. And I think sometimes conservatives conflate the two. Of course, no one is asking for the state to censor speech, but what we're asking for is elected officials and people who are community leaders to criticize speech. That's true to our philosophical founding. We have to speak out for equality. We have to speak out for justice. And they hide behind the First Amendment to justify basically a nihilism, where they don't believe that you can actually speak out for equal rights in this country.
Can I just add, too, that the
Tracy
fact that Congress...
Yes, please.
I like that.
Go ahead, Tracy.
About the stereotypes.
I was just going to say, the fact that the congressman made this lynching reference...
The U.S.
Go ahead. No, Tracy, you first. Please, Tracy, go.
The fact that this congressman made this lynching reference in a hearing about anti-American violence without knowing the history. Again, the largest mass lynching in the United States actually happened in Los Angeles in 1871. At least 17 Chinese men and boys were lynched. And so to make that reference in an anti-Asian violence hearing shows how much ignorance still exists about our people and our history.
Stanley?
Yes, underlying all this is that Asians are not regarded as Americans. As a matter of fact, we're viewed as foreigners. And in our laws, right from the beginning, the Naturalization Act of 1790, right? Almost at the beginning of our republic, Asians were not allowed to become U.S. citizens. Only free white men were allowed to do that. And over time, what has happened, that's been codified in other state laws as well as in case decisions. And currently, immigration laws uses the term alien. And during World War II, Japanese Americans were considered enemy aliens, even if they were citizens. So this is also underlying some of these remarks made by elected officials. That cultural bias towards the Asians, against Asians, continues. And all the other types of things that are occurring, the violence, because we're looked upon as not Americans and that we don't have full rights. And definitely we don't have justice because of that.
Can I chime in here?
That's such a good point. Tracy Jan, Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna of California, Russell Zhang, and Stanley Mark, thank you all for this incredible conversation. Really appreciate it.